Angola is one of Africa's richest sources for oil, but the wealth from black gold hasn't trickled down. It's been carved up to create one of the world's most unequal countries. After decades of civil war and corruption, everyday life is a strain for most people. But it's home to Africa's richest woman, President Dos Santos, nicknamed Princess. Forbes magazine estimates her wealth to be about $3 billion. She's also the eldest child of José Eduardo dos Santos, who has ruled Angola since 1979. Elections are due next year. Whatever the result is, Santos says he'll step down from office in 2018. But before that, he'll have to face the Supreme Court over the appointment of his daughter as head of the state-owned oil company Sonangol. Oil production accounts for 45% of the nation's GDP and more than 95% of its exports. Control over that business is closely linked to power in the country. The sharp decline in international oil prices has drastically hit the national budget. The government is struggling to provide basic services like sanitation and access to healthcare. And ordinary people are struggling to survive, creating an even wider divide between the people, the princess, and the president. Natalie Pohanen, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now is Frank Charnas in Tel Aviv. He is the CEO of Bodhi Intel, a political and economic risk consultancy group specializing in sub-Saharan Africa. Frank, thanks so much for joining us. I want to start by asking you about this case that's been filed by 14 lawyers in Angola against the president, accusing him of nepotism for appointing his daughter as head of Sonangol. First of all, has action like this ever been taken before in Angola? And how far do you think this case will go?
To my knowledge, no action like this has taken place in Angola. And it's hard to tell how far the case will go because Angola is a very strictly run one single party state. José Eduardo dos Santos has a very powerful control over the country, and it's unlikely that he will allow the courts to take this case further than it would go normally or really into an in-depth situation. So
it is pretty remarkable that they've gotten this far, is it not? The fact that it's become international news.
Yes. Angola is a really tightly run country, and the media is completely controlled by the government, by the ruling party, the MPLA. So it's, firstly, within Angola, very unusual to see any anti-MPLA or anti-Dos Santos message getting out. And secondly, it's even more rare to see any news coming out of Angola into the international spectrum.
And it's also very hard from the outside to get an idea of what President Dos Santos is actually like. She's been written up numerous times in Forbes magazine for being Africa's richest woman. I believe she claims a fortune of about $3 billion. Can you tell us anything about her? Is she, at the very least, a good businesswoman, or is she only the product of privilege?
Well, the jury is out on this. She's very definitely the product of privilege, and it does appear to be that the seed capital for what has become an empire was in fact supplied by the state, in some cases from Sonangol itself. So this would make it very easy for her to then go on to gain prominence as a business person with that backing. On the other hand, she has managed to accumulate $3.3 billion of wealth estimated. And in Africa, as a woman, and being the first black and the first African billionaire, female billionaire, this says a lot about her business acumen. So it's very difficult to tell how much of this is Isabella and her capacity as a business person, and how much of this is nepotism and the leg up that she was given from being her father's daughter.
Okay, now her father, José Eduardo dos Santos, has been in power since 1979. He's now indicated that he will step down in 2018, but he has indicated he'll step down before and then never did. The problem is here, there's an election in 2017. Why would he say he's stepping down a year after a free election is supposed to take place?
Well, it's likely that he would win an election, which wouldn't necessarily be free and fair, but he would win that election. And so it would be easier to pass on the leadership and to keep the reins of power within his close circle, probably his family, or to people really closely aligned to him.
Right.
So by announcing that he'll hand over power after the elections, what he does is he makes sure that he has the power and that then he can hand it over to whomever he chooses.
And they're talking about whom he chooses could possibly be President Dos Santos. Part of the reason he'd like to give her these positions in government. Are we possibly looking at another Gabon scenario with Omar to Ali Bongo, where there will be some sort of election and it will just be an empire to take power for decades and decades?
Possibly. Gabon's not the only example. There's Togo, there's the DRC, there's Equatorial Guinea. The situation is that for these leaders, the fear of losing power means that they might stand a persecution or a prosecution from the opposition parties, from the international community. Moreover, they could lose access that they have to the wealth of the country. So in many cases, it's the fear of losing power is actually the fear of losing their position and losing their futures. And so they do what they can to maintain a close control over that power.
Okay, Frank Charnas, we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us on the Newsmakers.